My name is Youngju Ryu, and I'm Assistant Professor of Korean Literature in the Department of Asian Languages and Cultures. Usually, No-jin Kwak, who is the Center Director, would introduce the speaker. He has, unfortunately, another engagement today. So on behalf of the Nam Center for Korean Studies, I'm very pleased to introduce Professor Karen Thornber, Assistant Professor of Comparative Literature, and also Director of Graduate Studies, I understand, at Harvard University. She received her PhD in 2006, and in that time, that would take most of us just to get acclimated to being a professor rather than a student. She has managed to be amazingly prolific, writing almost 3 books and receiving numerous honors in the process. Her first book is titled Empire of Text in Motion, Chinese, Korean, and Taiwanese Transculturations of Japanese Literature. The book moves beyond national boundaries to examine circulation of texts in the Japanese Empire. Her second book, Green Paradoxes, Environmental Crises and East Asian Literatures, which is forthcoming from our very own University of Michigan Press, I understand, inserts humans back into the environment and maybe even contemplates sort of planetary consciousness. And her third book will examine post-war cultural flows among East Asia, South and Southeast Asia, and Middle East, and maybe Africa as well. So Professor Thornber has been very much interested in flows in circulation and production of texts beyond the conventional boundaries. And for this work, then, she has received the Anna Balakian Book Prize for the best book in the world in the field of comparative literature by a scholar under the age of 40. And very recently, at the last Association of Asian Studies meeting in Hawaii, she received the John Whitney Hall Prize for the best English language book in any field of the Japanese humanities or social sciences. So I think these are really amazing opportunities for us to hear of her work. Now, I should note that this is our second attempt to have her in our midst. The first attempt was snowed out. I don't know if it was from our side or from Boston's side. It might have been Boston's side at that time. And so we were really hoping for our second attempt today that we'd be able to order some brilliant Midwestern sunshine. There's a little bit coming out now, but I think we'll have to satisfy ourselves with the fact that it's at least not snowing. Her talk today will draw, I understand, from her second book, Green Paradoxes. It's the timeliest of subjects as we contemplate and continue to reel from the natural disaster followed by human-made disaster in Japan. So please join me in welcoming Professor Karen Thornber to the podium.
Thank you for that most generous of introductions, and thank you as well for welcoming me back here. I was quite disappointed in February when we had 2 days of utter whiteout in Boston, and I'm so happy to be here. Yes, this talk, it does draw from my second book, and it's titled Changing Environments, Ecological Devastation, and Modern Korean Literature. And as Youngju said, this book is forthcoming from the University of Michigan Press, hopefully this fall. And it analyzes how the modern literatures of Korea, China, Japan, and Taiwan have grappled with human abuse of the natural environment. In the book, I introduced the concept of what I've called eco-ambiguity, or environmental ambiguity, by which I mean simply the complex, contradictory, and disjunctured interactions between people and the natural world. Now, as we all know, East Asia has long been associated with belief systems advocating reverence for nature, including Taoism, Buddhism, Confucianism, and Shinto. And so these modes of thought have for centuries inspired concern for environmental health in Asia, as well as in the Americas and Europe. Popular perceptions, both within and outside East Asia, often hold that environmental degradation in the region began in the late 19th century, when East Asian peoples, pressured by the West, assimilated Western technologies and industries. But in fact, East Asia is heir to thousands of years of intense manipulation of environments. So it's not surprising that Chinese, Japanese, Korean, and Taiwanese literatures, although famous for celebrating the beauties of nature and for depicting human beings as intimately connected with the non-human world, also portray people as damaging everything from small woodlands to the entire planet. And this is certainly true of Korean literature. Scholarship on 20th century Korean literature has called attention to how this corpus articulates the suffering of the Korean people: despair, poverty, illness, forced labor and conscription, imprisonment, rape, torture, and death as a result of Japanese colonialism between 1910 and 1945, the division of the peninsula into North and South Korea in 1945 that permanently separated families and resulted in a significant American military presence in the South to this day, the Korean War, and South Korea's post-war military dictatorships and corrupt administrations. Without question, human anguish resulting from human behavior, whether Japanese, American, or Korean, is a central part of the 20th and early 20th century Korean literary corpus. But violence by people against people is not the only trauma exposed by these writings. A number of creative works also grapple with anthropogenic damage to the natural world. So what I'd like to do today is begin with a few words on environmental problems in 20th and 21st century Korea. I'll then give a brief synopsis of modern Korean literary engagement with these problems. And then I'll analyze several Korean creative works that engage particularly effectively, I think, with ecological ambiguity. So first, some background: environmental degradation in modern Korea. Late 19th and early 20th century Korea experienced industrialization, rapid population growth, and steady urbanization, as well as new agronomic and fishery technologies and intense forest harvesting. These changes did improve the lives of many, but they also led to some sustained environmental problems, particularly pollution and biohabitat loss. Practices harmful to environments were instigated or intensified in the Japanese colonial period of 1910 to 1945. Japanese leaders frequently relied on local collaborators to subject Korea to numerous policies that exploited both its people and its natural environments. The colonizers increased agricultural production and soon depended on Korean crops to feed people in the metropole. In the 1930s, Japan began building heavy industries in Korea to advance its military agenda. As Carter Eckert and others have pointed out, while ruling Korea, the Japanese, who, as we know, depended on Korean labor, also constructed an extensive networks of roads and railways. They mined the colony's gold, silver, iron, and coal. They depleted its fisheries, they dammed its rivers, and they felled its forests so extensively that by the 1940s, only the remotest regions still enjoyed tree cover. The Korean War from 1950 to 1953 took the lives of nearly 3 million Koreans. It also devastated the peninsula's population and flattened its industries and cities. 1962, Park Chung-hee's coup d'etat ushered in decades of unprecedented industrial and urban growth in South Korea. Initially, the impact of all this on the Korean peninsula itself was not as substantial as one might imagine, since Koreans relied increasingly on imported metals, fossil fuels, wood products, and foodstuffs. But by the 1970s, eco-degradation at home became impossible to ignore, and South Koreans organized several small groups to heighten environmental consciousness. But even so, at this time, pollution generally was believed to be an inevitable price of economic growth. As Park Chung-hee had adamantly declared in 1962, quote, "Dark smoke rising from factories is symbolic of our nation's growth and prosperity." The powerful desire for industrial development, combined with the authoritarianism of Korea's military regime, meant that few at this time dared protest the nation's environmental policies. It was only in the 1980s, under Chun Doo-hwan, that South Korea developed its first comprehensive environmental program. This time, citizens also formed a number of green organizations that called attention to the high human and non-human costs of pollution, particularly onsan disease, which is an illness caused by heavy metal poisoning and resembles Japan's Itai disease. During the 1980s, South Korea's dependence on nuclear power also came under heightened scrutiny, and Koreans founded their first anti-nuclear movement in 1987. Surveys from this period indicate that a large majority of South Koreans believed environmental conditions in their nation a serious problem, and there was strong public support for efforts to curb eco-degradation. Yet despite some improvements, most notably for the 1988 Seoul Olympic Games, environmental health continued to decline. The early 1990s brought a number of significant environmental crises and protests. Plans to build a nuclear waste storage facility on Onmin Island, which is in Western Korea, met with considerable resistance, and a chemical spill in the Nakdong River near Daegu in Southeast Korea endangered the lives of about 1.5 million South Koreans and captured nationwide attention. Although in both cases the physical scope of the damage was actually relatively small, these incidents terrified the Korean population, and many people feared that they too might soon be directly affected by nuclear and other forms of pollution. On the other hand, although both environmental movements and the government's alleged commitment to solving ecological problems boomed in the 1990s, there was actually little improvement to the environment itself. As the scholar Soo-hoon Lee has noted, in 1996 alone, major incidents related to pollution or environmental deterioration included the illegal release of water from the contaminated Sihwa Lake, incidents of pollution illness reported on Yeocheon Petrochemical Industrial Complex, dead fish in major rivers, and summertime ozone-related smog in Seoul. And these trends, unfortunately, as in many parts of the world, have continued into the 21st century. Pollution, destruction of habitat, and decreasing biodiversity remain significant problems. Korea's most environmentally ambiguous phenomenon, perhaps, is its demilitarized zone, or DMZ, at once the world's most heavily militarized border and an accidental, eccentric wildlife preserve. Human settlements and farmlands in the region date back an estimated 5 millennia. But having been almost entirely free from human habitation since 1953, the area is now home to more than 1,000 plant species and hundreds of animal species, many of which are endangered in other parts of the world. So the DMZ has been heralded by some as a global treasure house of ecosystems, and experts have claimed that collaborative efforts to transform the DMZ into a UNESCO World Heritage Site are likely to improve relationships among the two Koreas and the other 6 party states. Don't laugh, this is true. At the same time, not only is the DMZ full of deserted villages and tens of thousands of unburied human corpses, it also is a site of continued army operations. In addition to defoliants and forest fires set for clearing, landmines are a significant problem. As a celebrated Korean fiction writer Kim Yong-ha once noted, "I remember waking at night, hearing deer exploding because of the landmines. I'd hear the sound of the explosion and would think of the deer lying there dying." So one could argue that much of the recent idealization of the DMZ as ecological paradise is somewhat illusory. So that's a brief synopsis of environmental problems in 20th and 21st century Korea. I'd like to turn now to another brief synopsis, this time, how has Korean literature dealt with these issues? In light of this intense environmental degradation, it's not at all surprising that much 20th and 21st century Korean literature contains at least brief references to environmental damage. Predictably, the number of texts published in South Korea mentioning, if not decrying, human abusive environments sharply increased in the late 1960s and early 1970s. One of the most celebrated works of this type is Kim Kwang-sop's Songbukdong Pidungi, or The Pigeons of Songbukdong, published in 1968. This poem features a pigeon that once enjoyed friendly relationships with its human neighbors, but now has been driven from its home by new construction. It has no place to perch, and its body is constantly being shaken by explosions from a nearby quarry. As a result, it's lost its ties to both people and the land. Its heart, once flooded with love and peace, now is described as literally cracked. The poem initially depicts the bird as attempting to comfort the people of Songbukdong, despite the fact that the animal itself has been dislocated. But the explosions prove too much even for short visits, and the animal eventually must abandon this space, leaving it barren of non-human inhabitants. While Kim Kwang-sop's poems are among the first in Korea to speak explicitly of damage caused by post-war urbanization and industrialization, creative work by writers such as Yoo Hyun-jong and Moon Sun-dae paved the way for discourse on transformation of rural areas. Yoo Hyun-jong discusses the ecology of the DMZ in Pimunjang-chide, or Demilitarized Zone, published in 1964, while in the short story Pyohanguro Kanon Param, or Wind Going to the Hometown, published in 1977, Moon Sun-dae exposes the plight of farmers whose lives are radically altered when a new dam submerges their village. We also have Kim Won-il's novella, Toyosae Kwanham Yongsan, or Meditation on a Snipe, published in 1979, which picks up where the pigeons of Songbukdong and Wind Going to the Hometown leave off. This text features a protagonist who actively protests the disruption to bird populations caused by the polluted Tongjin River. This text is regarded as one of the pioneering works of Korean environmental literature because it highlights the mistreatment of both people and the natural world under South Korean military dictatorship. The industrial complex in the novel resembles closely the Onsan industrial complex, which was constructed in the early 1970s and became the source of Onsan disease. Meditation on a Snipe references an echoes the style of Rachel Carson's famed environmental pollution expose, Silent Spring, which was translated into Korean at this time. Even more important, I'd argue, is the text's environmental cosmopolitanism. It argues that unless Koreans change how they interact with the natural world, Japan's Minamata disease and Itai disease and other pollution diseases soon will have their counterparts in Korea. South Korean creative attention to environmental degradation increased in the 1980s and the 1990s as damage to ecosystems grew even more severe. Unlike elsewhere in East Asia, poetry rapidly became the favored medium for addressing ecological degradation. And it's remained so into the 21st century, thanks to such figures as Tre Su-ho, Choi Sung-ja, Chung Hyun-jong, Kim Chun-soo, Kim Hye-sun, Kim Kwang-yu, Ko Moon-dok-soo, Song Soo-kwon, and Yi Hyung-gi. South Korean writers, including Tre Su-ho, also have published a number of novels and short stories that address harm inflicted on everything from individual animals to entire ecosystems. As is true of other literatures, some South Korean creative texts focus on human abuse of environments, while others make only passing reference to it. But more so than most creative corpuses, South Korean literature that addresses eco-degradation depicts it as closely related to human-on-human abuse. Literary texts frequently integrate discussions of the former, particularly environmental degradation resulting from war and industrialization, into those of the latter. This dynamic occurs in everything from Tre Su-ho's famous Little Ball Launched by a Dwarf, published in 1978, and one of Korea's first novels to speak extensively of industrial pollution, and Yi Nam-hwae's novel, Long Parting from the Sea, published in 1991, which is an account of Onsan disease. It also occurs in the internationally celebrated dissident writer Kim Chi-ha's Minjung Isori, Cry of the People, 1974, a lengthy poem decrying myriad types of injustice, including environmental degradation. While the narrator of Long Parting from the Sea accentuates the bodily damage caused by heavy metal poisoning, and the narrator of Little Ball Launched by a Dwarf plays up the high human cost of industrialization, the speaker of Cry of the People, who's writing not long after the 1973 Yom Kippur War, in which Arab states attacked Israel on Yom Kippur, this poem gives more space to the economic consequences of policies that increase the country's reliance on foreign oil. But these three texts leave no question as to the deadly effects of pollution on both people and the natural environment. Other contemporary South Korean writing addressing changes close to home that have worldwide resonance, or other contemporary South Korean works look at environmental problems that have worldwide resonance, such as the poet Hwang Tong-hyu's poem SOS, published in 1993, which features a speaker lamenting that the Han River no longer freezes in winter. And he speculates, quote, that winter must have disappeared for good. He reminisces about the days when, quote, ice lived. To be sure, his focus is less on global warming than on his own yearning simply to hear the sounds of cracking ice. But the speaker also points to the dangers of a land without winter. Houses in the village now remain damp year-round, a situation that, if not resolved, likely will result in their disintegration and the eventual crumbling of one community after another. So these are just some key examples from the vast corpus of modern Korean fiction and poetry that address environmental degradation. And the time remaining, I'd like to discuss several Korean texts that exhibit environmental ambiguity particularly clearly. Although my focus today in this forum is on Korean literature, as I stress in the book, it's very important that when dealing with global concerns, such as environmental degradation, we not confine ourselves to the problem of a single nation or even region. And I'd initially planned to organize this book around creative treatments of major environmental problems. I thought of comparing, for instance, Chinese, Japanese, Korean, Taiwanese, and other literary engagements with particular environmental problems, such as deforesting, damming, pollution, overpopulation, species eradication, climate change, and nuclear apocalypse. But the more I read, the more it became apparent that something quite different was at stake. So remember, throughout history, people have routinely damaged both proximate and distant landscapes, despite vast differences in cultures, despite differences in attitudes toward nature, and despite the differences in the ecosystems and the resilience of ecosystems. Environmental damage, of course, has varied greatly, yet there are few, if any, places that have not been harmed by the human footprint, literal or metaphorical. So I realized, or I thought at least, that it was important to analyze how literature as a form of discourse deals with causes and consequences of eco-degradation writ large. And once I no longer looked at text primarily through the lenses of individual societies or individual environmental problems, but instead focused on how creative works from disparate places negotiated more generally with ecological quandaries, their shared environmental ambiguity became unambiguously clear. The authorial, readerly, cultural, and environmental circumstances and identities behind the production of a particular text certainly mattered. I mean, there's no denying that, but they didn't matter as much as one might have presumed. Environmental ambiguity is a hallmark of everything from brief poems to multi-volume novels, from the work of writers known globally to those scarcely recognized within their own societies, from texts discussing relatively isolated ecological damage to those concerned with ruin on a global scale, from those that focus explicitly or almost exclusively on environmental distress to those that mention it only briefly, from works that celebrate eco-degradation to those that decry it, and from works published everywhere from the Americas to Europe to Asia, Africa, and beyond. And it's true that environmental ambiguity, or these very complicated relationships between people and the natural world, it's true that this phenomena appears more prevalent in literature from East Asia than in other textual corpuses. And its implications certainly are greater, considering the region's long cultural history of celebrating intimate ties between humans and nature, even as its people severely damaged environments. But with several notable exceptions, and especially within East Asia, these disjunctures and their many permutations did not depend as much on specific literary culture or environmental problems as one might anticipate. And so what I did in the book is move the focus to the concept of environmental ambiguity itself. Because languages, genres, styles, and tropes differ within and among cultures, as we all know, within and across cultures too, but the concerns raised have much in common. And so what I did is I argued that we should group literatures not only by language and nation, which of course is what we do in the academy, but also think more about grouping literatures by topic or concept. This is because damaged environments are a global phenomenon. So literary treatments of environmental degradation regularly transcend their particular cultures of production, and together form what I'd argue are these really amazing intercultural, thematic, and conceptual networks. And the poems I'll talk about in a few minutes, I'm talking about 3 of them, and you'll see some are very explicitly based in Korea, others not so much. They could take place anywhere, even though they're written by Korean writers and written in the Korean language. So one interesting phenomena that I noticed within all this environmental ambiguity is phenomena of myopia, or myopic hyperopia. I'll explain what I mean by that in a minute. So many creative texts, no matter where they're written, highlight how readily people unconsciously or deliberately ignore environmental degradation. They portray people as unconcerned even with visible damage to environments. People simply look away, pretend not to see threats to non-human and often human welfare, or they become blasé about their changing landscapes. Desire for instant gratification, hunger for immediate profit, obsession with surface appearances, in short, the limited perspectives characteristic of what we consider myopia often are shown to lie behind this indifference toward ecological damage. An important subset of texts concerned with the relationship between myopia and environmental degradation reveals myopia as frequently accompanied by hyperopia in what I've called myopic hyperopia. So unlike the term myopia, which refers both to ocular nearsightedness and more generally to a narrow perspective or lack of foresight and discernment, the term hyperopia conventionally refers to ocular farsightedness. Hyperopia can also point to a fixation on distant vistas, temporal or spatial, at the conscious or unconscious expense of more immediate realities. Now, these distant vistas are not necessarily seen or understood particularly clearly, as is the case in ocular hyperopia, but they are the center of attention. The modifier myopic in this highlights the frequent short-sightedness of such a fixation. So we see myopic hyperopia, of course, in writings like the Japanese writer Tanikawa Shintaro's poem, Sora ni kotori ga inakunata hi, or The Day Small Birds Disappeared from the Skies. We see it in a number of Chinese texts. We also see it in the Korean writer Tre Su-ho's poem Muye Mulare, or Below the Water, that's above the water, published in 1983. So while people in Tanikawa's verse think only of a more prosperous material future and joyously and blindly construct roads, ports, and parks, while animals, forests, seas are all either dying or becoming extremely polluted. Somewhat similarly, in Tre Su-ho's poem, Below the Water, you have a group of tourists en route to a recreation park, and they're intoxicated by the hotels and mountains that surround the lake across which they're traveling on a boat. They seem oblivious to the fact that the lake is heavily polluted. This poem describes ecological degradation near at hand as being ignored, deliberately or unconsciously, we're not sure, in favor of distant landscapes. So just a brief word about background before I read the poem. Tre Su-ho is one of Korea's most renowned eco-poets. His early volumes established his reputation as a writer highly critical of corruption pervading contemporary industrial society. Much of his oeuvre focuses on urban blight, describing everything from individual human and non-human bodies to entire landscapes as damaged severely by rapid industrialization and so-called modern civilization. Images of gruesome death are a staple of his work, and his poetry often overflows with references to waste of all kinds. Written in the early years of Korean environmentalism, that is the early 1980s, his poem Below the Water adopts an ecologically cosmopolitan approach featuring a scenario that could occur anywhere. There are lakes, mountains, hotels, and tourists. And I'll now read the poem. It says, while the tourists are crossing the tranquil lake, divers descend to the bottom of the lake to recover a corpse. And at the bottom, a colossal tomb of garbage with a fat belly that's growing silently, steadily bigger. Inside, the muddy water filled with silt, in which are needed discarded fetuses and larvae, and some cats and dogs. The belly of this colossal tomb of garbage is getting fatter because it ate a shoe, broken plastic containers, pieces of vinyl, a tomb that with time swells to a corpse-like body. Tourists they see this. They also see small, melancholy pond snails, their intestines rotting, poisoned by poison in the wastewater, evidence of civilizations born on the waterfront, festering together with all kinds of excrement coming out the rear hole. While the tourists are crossing the tranquil lake, headed toward a recreation park, drunk on the view of hotels and mountains surrounding the lake. So these mountains rising above the shores of the lake mesmerize, at least from afar, while those growing below the surface of the water are ignored except by the divers. So as you can see, below the water vividly exposes human abuse of natural environments. People have transformed a lake into their dumpster. They've injected it with solid and liquid waste. Tre Su-ho's poem also draws attention to the increasing heft of the rubbish mound, equating it first with a colossal tomb or an exorbitant, preposterous, absurd tomb that has a fat belly that's growing silently, steadily bigger. Then this colossal tomb is described as having a belly that's getting fatter. Then it swells. Again, this tomb is swelling, described as swelling, into a corpse-like body. The pregnant burial mound does not give birth, instead transforming itself, as I said, into this corpse-like body. Read metaphorically, these lines imply that life dies before it even has a chance to live. Significant as well is the absence of such qualifiers as total or like before the word belly, before the word tomb. The body of the tomb might be like a corpse, but the pile of garbage it creates, or the pile of garbage itself creates an actual tomb and an actual abdomen. Not surprisingly, this inflating tomb disrupts the lake's ecosystems and the non-human environment begins to disintegrate. While the tomb's abdomen continues to swell, the insides of marine animals decompose. The text speaks of small, melancholy pond snails, their intestines rotting, poisoned by the poison in the wastewater. These diminutive snails are utterly overwhelmed by the lake's contaminated waters. Below the water refers as well to discarded cats and dogs, indicating that human abuse of the non-human spreads well beyond the lake's shores. Significant, too, is how Tre Su-ho's text intertwines human abuse of nature with people's abuse of one another. Below the water is one of many texts that address human-induced damage to environments that feature people also disappearing into polluted bodies of water. It's unclear how the human body of the early lines of the poem became a corpse, much less one on the bottom of a lake that divers have been sent to retrieve. It's a case of murder or suicide, the result of an accident. It's unclear how long the body has been below the water, but after several weeks, most corpses float, if not weighted, suggesting the possibility of either foul play or that the person in the poem hasn't been dead for very long. The reference, of course, near the end to festering civilizations is far less subtle. Human civilizations, like lakes, are rotting away because of human behaviors. People risk drowning themselves and their natural environments, literally, in human waste. Tre Su-ho's poem does not merely liken the ends of sewers to anuses, instead explicitly labels them as such. He here establishes human bodies, then, as at once polluter and polluted. Below the water depicts people as risking total submersion, as I said, in actual and metaphorical excrement. After all, the burial mound is said to swell from a growing belly into an expanding cadaver faster than a boat can cross the lake, and it appears to be only a matter of time before the top of the mound breaches the surface and creates a mountain similar in shape, but very different in consistency from the mountains that surround the body of water, the mountains that are so appealing to these tourists. Contributing significantly to this risk, I would argue, is the disjuncture here between conditions, or considerable eco-degradation, and behaviors, the failure to acknowledge this degradation. Even more noteworthy than the poem's descriptions of tangible garbage is its expose of this phenomenon called myopic hyperopia. Because what you have here is the first and final lines of the poem are identical. They repeat while the tourists are crossing the tranquil lake. And the following lines, or the second stanza, which is the body of the poem, depict a scene, of course, that's anything but peaceful. The adjective tranquil, or chantan, describes solely the surface of the lake, if that. While tourists cross this allegedly calm surface, divers go to the bottom of the lake to recover a corpse, and there they find, as we saw, a literal tomb of garbage. Most of Below the Water describes the horrors seen by these divers. Until the poem's third and final stanza, then, Below the Water seems primarily to expose the hidden abuses inflicted on a body of water. The text suggests that despite the nearly bursting garbage hills growing out of the lake's bottom, the surface remains for the most part unaffected. But this all changes in the concluding stanza, because here we learn what the tourists see and how they see it. They're transfixed by both human constructions, these hotels, and the mountains that line the shores of the lake. I'll repeat this line. The tourists were drunk on the view of the hotels and mountains surrounding the lake. And we're also informed at the end of the poem that the tourists are heading to nothing other than a recreation park. They're so transfixed with faraway scenery and likely so preoccupied by going in a particular horizontal direction, the poem states they're headed toward this park, that they don't notice what's overtaking the lake, much less recognize its own menace to their health, let alone to ecosystems more generally. Below the Water suggests that these and similar failures are intricately connected with intensified degradation of environments. People sometimes are so preoccupied with distant bodies whose likely degradation is not visible precisely because of their distance, the damage closer at hand goes unnoticed. In other words, considering the extent to which the lake's ecosystems have been damaged, it's doubtful that the land on which the hotels are built have been spared. Garbage likely is washed up on the shores outside the hotels, but too much space separates the boat from the hotels for the tourists to be able to see this garbage. And that makes the tourists, of course, very happy. The hotels themselves are part of this civilization born on the waterfront about which the poem talks, and the hotels likely pollute the lake as well with their own untreated excrement. And this too would be difficult to detect from afar, to detect from the deck of a boat sailing in the middle of the lake. But one of the greatest ironies, I think, of Tre Su-ho's poem is that the tourists are preoccupied with nature as well. So unlike the divers who simply see, or pora, what lies beneath the surface of the water, the tourists are described as quite literally drunk, or trihara, on nature. So they're in love with nature, they're drunk with nature, captivated by it. Below the Water shows that appreciating the non-human does not necessarily translate into protecting it, or even having any real interest in it. The text reveals how focus on these faraway spaces at the expense of those nearby can in fact facilitate destruction of the natural world. So while environmental discourse often assails myopia for its excessive concern with the proximate, for its failure to consider the larger consequences of particular choices, and to be sure, myopic behavior does drive much ecological degradation. Damage to environments, particularly their non-human components, is well nigh inevitable, I think we'd all agree, as long as concerns of the moment outweigh those of the future, as long as demands of the self and immediate social group overshadow those of others, as long as concern for human welfare always prevails over the health of other species. But by portraying divers with myopic vision as seeing a mountain of garbage, and tourists with myopic hyperopic vision as drunk on mountains, the poem surprisingly stresses the value of myopia in the sense of paying attention to conditions close at hand. This isn't depicted as a cure-all. Of course, because the divers are as blind to the landscape surrounding the lake as the tourists are to the ecosystems of the lake itself, even its surface. Moreover, the divers are merely described as seeing the pile of garbage, not as reacting to it in any way. They're there to recover a corpse, not meditate on the landscape. Yet even in even the most extreme environments, these myopic perspectives can be, this poem would suggest, just as valuable as their ocular hyperopic counterparts. Unlike Tre Su-ho's poem Below the Water That's Above the Water, which, as we just saw, depicts people completely ignoring ecological destruction, texts such as Tre Su-ho's poem Nangaekjuen Toshiezo, or In the Refrigerated City, published in 1991, show how readily perceptions can be manipulated to downplay damage to the non-human. The poem In the Refrigerated City points to the disjuncture between the desired, consumable appearance of non-human bodies and the impact attaining this appearance has on these bodies and ecosystems more generally. Recounted in the first person, the poem In the Refrigerated City discusses dead and dying marine animals in both the ocean and the supermarket. And this poem brings out the misunderstandings of human impacts on environments that can result from the sight of diced, processed, and anonymous cuts of meat. The opening stanza contrasts water made bloody from harpooned whales with store displays of packaged, labeled, and refrigerated whale meat. And I'll read here from the opening stanza. It goes, a summer day when blood spouts into the sea from whales pierced and overturned by the harpoons of whaling ships. When supermarket doors open, goods in refrigerated air currents. There are surveillance cameras above my head. Surveillance mirrors reflect me here and there. So although easily visible to whalers and sea animals, the gruesome ocean scene the poem describes, not ascribed to whaling ships of any particular nationality. Again, this could be a supermarket anywhere. This is hidden from most people. Whale meat is sanitized for visual and gastronomic consumption, landing in supermarket refrigerators looking nothing like whales, living or slaughtered. Security equipment records every move shoppers make, but society obscures the legal, economic, and physical processes that enable some of the world's largest mammals to be transformed into nameless slabs of flesh. Few people, the poem suggests, stop to think about the origins of this meat and how it arrived at their shores. The third and final stanza of In the Refrigerated City describes the shopping experience in more detail. These 4 lines read, a summer day when the city supermarket, where women with shopping baskets crane their necks, roaming between goods and labels, travels like a merchant ship in the noise and sun. These lines depict the supermarket as a place where commodities are deposited in baskets, a place where people can peacefully wander about, separated from sights of carnage. To highlight the difference between the ocean and the store, the poem likens the supermarket to a merchant ship, not to a whaling vessel. The former is more likely to carry goods already made presentable for sale, rather than freshly killed animals. Tre Su-ho's poem can be read as a statement against whaling, but it's an especially strong comment on the disparities between living animals on the one hand and on their deaths and reconfiguration for store shelves on the other. In the Refrigerated City begins with whales, but quickly broadens its scope to include other animals. The first stanza concludes with 2 lines on crustaceans that suggest that these animals just might be spared the fate of their larger marine counterparts. Whereas whales are spouting blood, as I read earlier, crabs are spouting sea foam. Whereas whales are harpooned, crabs are described as resisting, indicating that they might have somewhat more control over their lives. Yet the second stanza reveals that they're not in open water, but confined in a bucket, facing a fate similar to that of the whales. The poem reads, and the small crabs that refuse to be ransomed swarm and spout sea foam, the dying small crabs dying in a barrel. Caught on camera, their deaths are available for human visual consumption. The crabs might at first refuse to be ransomed, which is a very curious phrase suggesting agency that doesn't in fact exist, but ultimately they can't thwart death either. To be sure, the demise of other animals is better disguised. Listing the contents of one of the store's refrigerators, Tre Su-ho's poem reveals animals placed among a variety of plant foods, all kept reasonably fresh by the machine's chilled air. Refrigerator currents are relatively noiseless, a far cry from the din outside the case, much less the plaintive sounds, almost certain to accompany death, that occur outside this refrigerated city. And I'll read here again from the poem. He writes, curled onions, swarms of silent anchovies, spruced up by leeks and crown daisies. The refrigerated currents silently flow. My consciousness touches the icy bones of the dead fish inside the refrigerator. Unlike the swarms of crabs mentioned in the opening line of the stanza, the anchovies here have already been killed. Nearly frozen and therefore nearly odorless, they rest peacefully, waiting to be scooped up by customers. Most interesting here is the speaker's comment that his consciousness touches the icy bones of these dead fish. And he elaborates on this remark at the end of the third stanza in the text's final lines. He says, warm blood that begins in the bones, cosmic current of swirling blood. It's not clear here which bones he means, his own, those of the fish in the supermarket's refrigerators, both. The narrator could be suggesting that witnessing the transformation of sea animals into a form belying the traumas they've suffered has awakened within him deep emotions. Or he could be referring to the physiology of these animals when they're alive. Either way, the reference to cosmic currents recalls the circulating refrigerated air and bloodied water of earlier stanzas. This swirling blood of the poem's final line echoes the spouting blood of its second line. Swirling blood becomes spouting blood. When these animals are killed, bloody water currents are replaced by chilled drafts. Now, Tre Su-ho's poem is titled In the Refrigerated City, not In the Refrigerated Supermarket, expands the spatial scope of the text, and so too does the poem, speaking generally about a city rather than identifying one particular urban space. And Tre Su-ho's poems do this a lot. They talk in very general terms about the various sorts of environmental degradation. These strategies encourage awareness of the greater attention people, regardless of nationality, are likely to pay to the refrigeration or preservation of pieces of animals than to preserving the animals themselves in their original habitats. These strategies likewise highlight the human proclivity to think less about the slaughter of animals than their processing and packaging. Describing how the sight of icy bones in a refrigerator makes the speaker think of warm and swirling, not warm and spouting blood, the poem suggests that even when people stop to consider incarnations of the animals inside, earlier incarnations of the animals inside the refrigerators, they imagine living animals, not carcasses. The more spaces become refrigerated, literally and figuratively, the more perceptions of animals and human transformation of animals are altered and sanitized, and the more illusions and delusions are propagated. So unlike Tre Su-ho's Below the Water That's Above the Water, which depicts people completely ignoring ecological destruction, and his In the Refrigerated City, which I just discussed, which shows how readily perceptions can be manipulated to downplay damage to ecosystems, the Korean writer Tre Su-ho's lengthy poem, Yoido Kangsigok, or Rhapsody of Yoido, published in 1986, acerbically highlights the senselessness and despair of human existence, ridiculing Koreans for deluding themselves that their culture is simply because they exhibit or enjoy metropolitan attitudes, behaviors, and lifestyles. Tre Su-ho was a German literature major in college, and she made her mark as a poet in the aftermath of the Gwangju Uprising in 1980. Incorporating vulgarisms and other rough language, her verse departs from the typical female poetry of the 1960s. Its depiction of powerful women stranded in dignity provided the foundation for a new Korean feminism. On the other hand, much of her verse brims with despair, featuring individuals who compare themselves to mold, urine stains, maggot-infested bodies, and syphilis germs. And as for some background on this particular poem, Yoi Island, or Yoido, often called Korea's Manhattan, is Seoul's largest island and home to South Korea's stock exchange, the headquarters of numerous corporations, banks, and broadcasters. It's also the location of South Korea's National Assembly, and so it's a frequent site of political protests. The island is now protected from the waters of the Han River by dikes, and it boasts some of Seoul's most valuable real estate. But for centuries, it was used as farmland. During the colonial period, the Japanese built an airfield there, but it really wasn't until the 1960s that large-scale construction began. Tre Su-ho's poem argues that this culture of incessant consumption and production injures both people and the non-human. Like much Korean verse on devastated environments, from its opening section, Rhapsody of Yoido integrates portrayals of human anguish with scenes of damaged landscape. In addition, the poem concludes its first, fourth, and sixth and final stanzas with ironic declarations about Yoido's status as bread of heaven, or Chomsang Ipan. Rhapsody of Yoido converts the biblical bread of heaven sent down by God to nourish people both physically and spiritually. It converts this into a polluted, fermenting, swelling mass. By doing so, the poem accentuates the enormity of environmental destruction. People have devastated the one thing that can save them, both physically and spiritually. The poem also accentuates conflicts between perceptions and empirical evidence. People might believe this island is the bread of heaven and that it's brought wealth to so many, but they have transformed its character into something that quickly risks becoming the hellish world of shantytowns and trash, so graphically portrayed in the Turkish writer Latif Tenkin's novel Berce Kristin, or Tales from the Garbage Hills, published in 1984, the same year as Rhapsody of Yoido. The opening stanza of Rhapsody of Yoido likens protesters swarming across Wonho Bridge to heavenly dough in the process of fermenting. In contrast, the fourth and sixth sections of the poem use the same metaphor to describe the island's rising trash heaps. So people are replaced, if not buried, by their garbage, which appears to have overtaken the island. The poem's first section concludes, gradually fermenting in the sunlight of noxious pigments, gigantic lumps of dough beginning to ferment, yoido, bread of the sacred heavens. Here the dough is only starting to ferment, but it soon will begin rising uncontrollably. The poem's following sections reveal people and landscapes as horribly distorted. Tre Su-ho maximizing her command of graphic language and imagery by speaking of people baking bread and walking around, quote, with hearts, genitals, anuses hanging on their faces. By the conclusion of the poem, this bread gyrates frenziedly. Yoido lying on its back is a giant myropod. Neon signs are attached to the end of each of its innumerable feet, and it wiggles tens of thousands of its toes toward the sky. Its mouth that from morning to night has eaten all manner of filth, quietly vomits it up like crab's froth. The deepest part of Yoido's void, its dark, gigantic mouth that assumes the shape of God, chews on the remaining bones of this world. Yoido, bread of the sacred heavens. Equating the island with an insect that tirelessly flashes infinite numbers of neon lights and gorges itself on human waste, these stanzas reveal some of the contradictions of civilization. Tremendous glitter, right? We have Yoido's swarms of whitely lit skyscrapers, which, like those of most densely built cities, resemble a supine insect with flashy footwear. But this flash is accompanied by endlessly swelling garbage mounds. The waste that civilization produced can be ingested by the natural environment, but it cannot be sufficiently digested. So it's spewed forth, the poem describes, increasing the volume of the island and burying it even more deeply in garbage. No part of this landmass is spared. The poem describes even the most remote corners as diligently chomping away on scraps. More critical of the injuries people have inflicted on their environments is the first stanza of the poem's fourth section, which explicitly addresses the question of culture or civilization. The poet writes, time flows efficiently by itself. Look, atop our garbage heaps, atop the reeking and profound culture's oven, rapidly spreading odor, huge swelling and rising yoido bread of the colossal heavens. Here the text not only satirizes perceptions of the island as heavenly bread capable of nourishing and feeding all, it also exposes the underside of contemporary Korean lifestyles, which it argues cooks and creates or shapes this bread using an oven of culture that has replaced that of spirituality. Describes Korean culture as at once reeking and profound, its sleek buildings unable to mask either their trash or ultimately their gradual self-burial. The refuse continues to increase and threatens to plug spaces between buildings. Tre Su-ho's text portrays the destruction of ecosystems as deeply intertwined with the destruction of Korean culture and of culture more generally. Fooling themselves that environments are able to sustain behaviors intended to improve their civilization, the poem argues that people jeopardize the future of both human and non-human lives. Rhapsody of Yoido vividly depicts a society nearly oblivious that it's charging directly into oblivion. So it's very interesting that despite these poems like this, despite the number of Korean texts that address environmental degradation, in its early years, Korean language scholarship on literature and the environment focused largely on the output of Western writers, such as Rachel Carson, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Gary Snyder, Henry David Thoreau, all of whom have been very popular with South Korean environmentalists, writers, and academics since the 1970s. Gary Snyder in particular, Gary Snyder's deep involvement with East Asian societies, philosophies, and religions made his work particularly attractive to South Koreans. But today, scholars in Korea are increasingly reconceptualizing late 20th century Korean literature as deeply concerned with both human and non-human suffering. And so too are South Korean environmental groups and the public. To give one example, since 2002, the South Korean Citizens Movement for Environmental Justice has held an annual environmental book fair to encourage reading on the environment. And titles for recommended reading are drawn primarily from Korean and Western literatures, but they also include texts from elsewhere in East Asia. Like most literatures, that from South Korea generally does not provide its readers with solutions to environmental problems, but it does address many of the peninsula's ecological dilemmas and engage with the complexities of their origins, proliferation, and mitigation. Speaking more generally, far from resolving the ecological conundrums it describes, most literature that addresses environmental distress further ambiguates these ambiguities, bringing to light even greater discrepancies. In fact, one could argue that poetry and prose regularly counter the unstable, inverted pyramids of environmental Ponzi schemes with their own mushrooming miasmas of environmental ambiguity or confusion or disruption. Creative writing often makes matters even more confusing by remaining silent about its uncertainties. Many narrators and characters seem unaware of the discrepancies they depict or exhibit. Indeed, to the extent that they're aware of them, people often suppress the contradictions of their interactions with environments. So this being the case, analyses of literature can provide sharp lenses for deeper insights into the processes of environmental degradation by highlighting creative articulations of these disjunctions. Better understanding the uncertainties and contingencies of eco-degradation in literature and in life should allow, I hope, for more productive relationships among people in the natural world. So this talk today has discussed only a tiny fraction of the tremendous variety of writing, Korean and other, that engages with ecological challenges. But as we look more closely at writing that engages, but as we look more closely at how this writing addresses environmental degradation, and for that matter, other problems of global scope, I'd argue for more fluidity and flexibility in literature scholarship. I suggest not only that we look more closely at how individual literatures address urgent matters of global concern, but also that we consider literary negotiations with these issues regardless of the national corpus to which the texts belong. In other words, I suggest that even as we probe deeper into cultural context and learn more about the specificity of individual cultures, we also use topics or concepts as bases of analysis. For instance, how we conceptualize global problems like poverty, slavery, disease, and environmental degradation is enriched, I think, by examining multiple literatures of various world regions and, to the extent possible, multiple regions around the world. Analyzing literary treatments of these phenomena as expressed in various languages and cultural settings can lead to a clearer understanding of shared problems and a better basis, I would hope, for resolving them. And again, this isn't to deny the importance of cultural specificity. It's crucial to understand the local and national context in which literature is produced. And it's certainly true that even as literatures become more global, they often become more national. But beyond focusing on what's written in particular languages or cultural spheres, I think we should also analyze how literatures from multiple sites treat these shared phenomena found in one form or another across the world. So the shift is in many cases subtle. For example, from studying how Korean literature discusses pollution to examining literary engagement with pollution by incorporating examples from several cultures, including Korea. But when we change frames of reference, the shift is nearly always significant. This is because we start not with Korea or any individual nation or people, but instead with the global problem of pollution. And the shift, I think, is even more significant when the focus is concepts, such as environmental ambiguity, rather than topics, such as pollution. So moving the spotlight away from looking solely at what narratives tell us about specific peoples and places, to what they also reveal about widespread human and non-human phenomena, in this case abuse to people in the natural world writ large, I think helps us break down some of our barriers of isolation, insularity, and exceptionalism. And this approach, I hope, allows for new understandings, insights, and interpretations of cultural processes across time and space. As the texts I've discussed today suggest, particularly those of Tre Su-ho, creative negotiations with ecological destruction tend to open themselves or be more easily open to the world and discourse on other global problems. Such texts speak bluntly about global apocalypse, or they liken conditions in one space to conditions half a world away, or they focus on traumas inflicted on a particular space or non-human body that might infiltrate or be located or duplicated in any number of sites. So both their origins and their outlooks, these and similar literary strategies can increase planetary consciousness. And this is true, interestingly enough, even if the texts examined have not themselves traveled far, have not been translated or intertextualized or discussed, or even been available in more than one literary space. It's true even if the texts are written in a language that's not frequently translated or even known by many outside a particular place. Literature on ecological devastation, no matter its cultural and environmental origins, regularly reaches out to the broader world, and so too, I think, should the literary critic and the reader. And in conclusion, I'd just like to say that, these days discourse on environmental and disciplinary crises abounds. Many contend that ecological calamities are likely to be the most pressing issues of the 21st century. And many also argue, sadly, that literature scholarship and the humanities more generally are in flux, if not in crisis. And we all know that these dilemmas are not going to be easily resolved. But I think scholarship on individual cultures can provide vital foundations for understanding specific contexts of ecological abuse. I think also the fields of comparative and particularly world literature can help us appreciate more fully how creative writing and scholarship on creative writing can both reinforce and defy national, cultural, linguistic, political, and ecological divisions. Eco-criticism, other brands, or other types of environmental humanities can demonstrate especially clearly the exciting possibilities for humanistic intervention in eco-degradation. Yet there's still a lot of work to be done. So without abandoning our time-honored approaches, perhaps we humanists need to collaborate a little more with one another, to expand our cultural and disciplinary scopes, incorporating more diverse materials and methodologies, even while nurturing expertise in new and specific areas. And ideally, working with colleagues in the social, physical, and even life sciences, we can develop deeper connections among disciplines with the ultimate aims of embracing more fully the wider world, culturally, geographically, and biophysically, and of analyzing how the cultural products to whose study we devote our professional lives do the same. Thank you very much.
We have time to take a few questions.
Yeah.
Well, you're talking about poetry regarding environmental. Are there a lot of people in Korea that are studying environmental degradation in colleges, and is there a scientific, a lot of people producing scientific literature on this?
Oh yes, very much so. I mean, environmental problems are, I don't want to say they're the first priority of sciences in Korea, but they certainly are a priority. And what I've discovered is more and more over the years, more and more universities are developing environmental studies programs, or at least introducing environmental studies courses, training the younger generation of Korean students in how to address these concerns. They're sending students abroad to study this. But what's really interesting is that in the field of literature, as I hinted, most of the focus has not been on Korean literature and environment. It's been on American literature and the environment. And the association, Korean's Association for Literature and Environment, until very recently, was almost entirely comprised of scholars of English and American literature. And they said quite bluntly, we don't want scholars of Korean literature in here, because scholars of Korean literature are old-fashioned. So they let some of this disciplinary rivalry that exists within the Korean Academy sort of infiltrate into study of literature and environment. And so it's been very disappointing for me, the sort of work that's been done in the humanities in Korea, although that's definitely changing. The last 5 years, that's definitely changed. But certainly in the sciences, Koreans are at the forefront. Yeah. Yes, I saw that in your hand first.
I very much appreciate the concluding remarks you made about cross-disciplinary approach, and also this transnational approach, right? I have two questions which may also sound like comments, but I'd love to hear your response. One is this phenomenon that poetry seems to be the preferred literary form by which contemporary Koreans since the 80s express this concern with environmental degradation. So one question that I have is, why poetry, right? And then, is poetry the most effective form or most effective medium in raising people's consciousness? I noticed you use the term planetary consciousness. And I can imagine a documentary, photography, and numerous other possibilities for the same purpose, to change people's perceptions, to raise their awareness of their environment, to introduce new possibilities, so on and so forth, right? So I wonder to what extent that should also be part of this discussion in terms of this cross-media development, which then leads to the other side of my comments or observation here. Namely, I see a fascinating parallel between what may be called environmental literature and the old-fashioned political literature.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
Political literature was about raising people's consciousness, about changing people's understanding of reality, so that they could take action, so that they could intervene. So this all has to do with mobilization. I wonder whether methodologically that body of scholarship on Marxist literature and on political literature from the 20th century and all the way to the present can be brought into a conversation with this environmental literature that we are interested in studying now.
No, I mean, to answer the second question first, absolutely. I think it's not really been done to date, not at least that I'm aware of. But I think if scholars, again, scholars of environmental literature looked at this, more political literature, I think certainly they could develop, I don't want to say new theories, but certainly I think by bringing people's attention to the similarities between the two literatures, bringing the two literatures in dialogue, I think that would be actually a very effective thing to do. But even more than that, I think, particularly if you look at poetry of Kim Ji-ha, for instance, which is, very political and very much about raising people's consciousness, a lot of that poetry actually already deals with environmental problems. And so I think that is that perhaps might be one of the most effective ways of getting people more interested, or getting Korean scholars more interested in Korean language environmental literature, is pointing out how, you know, these revered poets like Kim Ji-ha are already talking about these issues and already are combining the environmental and the political. Because I think what a lot of the texts either argue explicitly or at least suggest is that you can't really separate the two. Because environmental problems, abuse of the non-human environment, is very closely related to abuse of human beings. I mean, I don't want to say you can't have one without the other, but they often appear together. And so I think if we look at that angle, or scholars focus more on that angle, yes, I think that is certainly part of the future of Korean writing, Korean scholarship on environmental literature. The question on poetry, it's very interesting. Every time I give a talk that mentions Korea and the prevalence of poetry, I get asked that question. I wish I had a good answer for it. The only thing I can think of, and I'm not happy with this answer, but what has struck me more and more is that the Korean writers writing about environmental degradation tend to be even more globally oriented, planetarily oriented than their counterparts, say in China, Japan, Taiwan, the other three countries with which I'm most familiar. And what poetry allows one to do is speak in very general terms, because you're not, I mean, it's very hard to tell a story without sort of placing it somewhere identifiable. I mean, you can refer to a town in which something is taking place as Town X or Mr. Y, but these cultural markers, the more words you have, the more cultural markers just tend to emerge. What's really interesting about a lot of this Korean environmental poetry is that there aren't any, or very, very few cultural markers. And poetry allows you to do that. And from what I've read of essays of Korean writers who do ecological literature, I do get the sense that they're more concerned than, again, counterparts elsewhere in East Asia with thinking about global environmental issues. This doesn't mean they're not concerned with what's happening in Korea. They're absolutely concerned with what's happening in Korea. But they're also thinking beyond Korea and thinking that what's happening here in Korea is being repeated everywhere else, and poetry is a medium that allows one to do it. One time, or one of my colleagues has suggested to me, you know, she said, well, maybe it's because in Korea, fiction is so commercialized these days, and people fear that if they were to write a novel on industrial pollution, it wouldn't sell. I mean, it's true, fiction's commercialized in Korea, but it's commercialized all over East Asia. So I'm not so happy with that answer. But I think in the case of some writers, there is the sense that poetry maybe will be taken more seriously and they have more freedom with the poetry. In terms of across media, yes, I mean, when I'm saying poetry more than other genres, I mean poetry more than prose, than short stories, than drama, than novels. I don't mean more than documentary film or photography, because there's a lot of that in Korea. That's not my area of expertise, unfortunately, but I think you're right, and I think that's another direction that scholars of Korea and humanists with an interest in Korea, I think that's absolutely a wide open area, is to look at films, either documentary or otherwise. You know, how is Korean cinema addressing these issues? So, yeah, great questions, Dan. Yes.
I just wondered if you knew anything about the translation and circulation of the Japanese novel by Ishimune.
Right.
Partly, I mean, I'm interested because, it sort of connects to two things you've been talking about. One is that as far as genre goes, it's very experimental and kind of breaks conventions with genre and style.
Right.
And the other thing is it's really considered and had the effects of a kind of movement literature, movement novel. So, I mean, I'm wondering, and I assume that Korea has a similar set of problems.
Oh, yes.
And so that was published in '69, I think?
68, I think, yeah.
How quickly was it translated? How did it circulate? What kinds of responses? Do you know anything about that?
You know, I don't even know if it has been translated. I want to say that it has. I think one of the things that really interests me, particularly because my first book was so much about translation and textualization, is how little of Japanese environmental literature has been translated into Korea, vice versa, all across East Asia. These contacts between writers, they're not translating one another's environmental literature. That being said, they certainly know of Ishimura. They certainly are very aware of her involvement in Japanese politics. They certainly, Korean writers are certainly very aware of this novel. The novel to which we're referring is Paradise Kugai Jodo, or Paradise in the Sea of Sorrow, on Minamata disease, which was an illness of mercury poisoning in Minamata Bay in Kyushu, southern Japan, in the 1950s and 1960s. And is still by far the most famous Japanese novel on environmental problems. I think this experimental form that Ishimura uses, because she does this patchwork of she tells personal stories of her own involvement with Minamata patients. She tells the stories of Minamata patients in their own words. She includes snippets from doctors, medical reports. She includes snippets from newspaper reports. So it really is this hodgepodge of genres, giving many different perspectives on Minamata disease. You do find that to some extent in some Korean environmental literature, but I don't want to say that Ishimura's style had any significant impact on Korean environmental writing. I mean, I could be proved wrong on that. I'd be happy to be proved wrong. But so in terms of literary technique, not so much. In terms of inspiring Korean writers to address these issues, inspiring Korean activists to talk about Onsan disease and raise political consciousness, absolutely. So,
Just a couple of things. One, following up on Chopin's question about white poetry. Could the fact that poetry is a genre that was used to celebrate nature and landscape have something to do with this current use of poetry now?
Yes.
And the other question that I had is you chose 3 poems for us that engaged with questions consumption, digestion, indigestion, waste. Is that deliberate? Is that your selection, or is this somehow representative of a huge trope that's at work in this particular body of stuff that you're looking at?
Yes. Well, it was done deliberately to try to tie. You have an hour. You can only talk about so much. So to have some coherence, just thematically. But that's being said, you do find this obsession with waste in a lot of Korean environmental literature. Again, perhaps more than what I found in literatures from elsewhere in East Asia, although again, not having read everything, it's very hard to make a definitive comment. That's the sense I get. So this is it's a common trope, and thinking about thinking about consumption in terms of waste, in terms of garbage, in terms of, mountains of garbage replacing the actual natural mountains. That's all over the place in Korean lit. On the other hand, it's all over the place in a lot of environmental literatures. I mean, I'm struck with how often it appears in Korean literature, but truly it's one of those things that, again, one of those reasons that makes me want to look at environmental literature in a global context rather than, what's Korea doing or what's China, what's Japan doing. Because again, garbage is garbage is garbage, and what happens with garbage is similar, right, wherever you go. So. And the question about poetry and relation to classical poetry, which of course all across East Asia celebrates nature, I think that's a very plausible explanation. Certainly modern Korean poets are very conscious of themselves as doing something very different from their classical counterparts. But then the question is, well, why aren't we seeing this happen in Chinese poetry or Japanese poetry? Because, as we know, classical Chinese and Japanese poetry also are celebrating nature. Why aren't contemporary Japanese and Chinese poets writing environmental literature to the same extent as their Korean counterparts? So it works, absolutely, but I wonder also, why not China?
So I have just some thoughts that were generated by your talk. I'm thinking about your comment about how English lit faculty and scholars tend to monopolize eco-criticism in Korea, and then
and here too. But
And I have a couple of thoughts about that. I think the prefix eco has an association with the first world. In the development of Korean literary history. And I think that has also something to do with why poetry could be seen as a privileged medium for ecological concerns. Tre Su-ho, the poet that you mentioned, has been classified in Korean literature as a lyric poet, first of all, and as someone who was not political, who was ecological, at a time when political men had more to do with dissidence against authoritarian regime, maybe also about class interests. And so I'm really struck, and I never thought about it this way, so thank you for your talk. I'm struck by the way in which sort of class politics and dissident politics and ecological politics become sort of mutually exclusive categories in terms of classificatory schemes within Korean literature.
Right.
Certainly there are many novels and works of poetry that are classified as sort of labor works that deal with ecological issues in the context of the oppression on human suffering caused by industrialization, but they're sort of exclusively classified as class literature. So that might be one of the reasons why that you see this predominance of ecological concerns in poetry in the lyric genre.
Which just shows you how, dangerous is too strong a word, but it shows you how risky it is, right, to do these literary classifications. This is labor poetry, this is political poetry, this is ecological poetry. Because a lot of the labor poetry, if you go back and look at it, it does talk about disease, caused by chemicals in the factory, in the water. It's there. The ecological resonances are there. It's just for obvious reasons. For so long, Korean scholars and Korean population at large was more concerned with the more explicitly political aspects. That's very understandable why. But it also shows as literary scholars, we have to be really careful, not just literature scholars, but humanists more generally, we have to be really careful about our classifications and how we think about these literatures, because exactly as you're pointing out, we miss so much if we just think of this as political or as ecological poetry. And I wouldn't even want to say that the poems I read are ecological poems. I'd want to say and this is what I say in the book, they address, these are texts that address ecological issues or address complicated relationships between people and the environment. Because they address that, but they also address a heck of a lot more. I like the idea of what you said, eco's association with the first world and poetry as this privileged genre. I think that works really well. The sad sort of result of that, I guess, in Korea, and then what's happening in Korea, of course, is mirrored in many, many places, is that the whole field of eco-criticism has been almost entirely dominated by scholars of Western literature, particularly scholars of English and American literature, until very, very recently. There have been a number of new books on post-colonial literatures and environmental concerns. But again, that's just looking at literature written in Western languages, albeit from Africa, Caribbean, South America, etc. And I think, for any students in the room who've been studying Asian languages and are looking for exciting topics to work on, I mean, absolutely looking at environmental resonances in East Asian literatures. It's a wide open field, and it's one that really needs to be, we need to do more of, because I'm tired, quite frankly, of going to conferences on literature and environment and being told, oh, well, East Asia doesn't really have much literature on environmental crises. They say things like this on the listservs and all that. I'm like, yeah, actually we do, and that's what I'm trying to, part of what I'm trying to do in this book. But it's a wide open field. So for all the students out there, if you're looking for a great topic, this is it.
So how much of this eco-poetry has been translated so that we can read in class?
Yeah, see, that's a problem. Not so much. There is a volume that's been that includes poetry by Tre Su-ho. I think it includes A Refrigerated City. So there's a bit of translation out there. Certainly the classics of environmental literature from Japan and China have been translated. Ishimure's novel's been translated. The Chinese writer Jiang Wong's Wolf Totem, that's been translated, although greatly condensed from the original. So there's enough out there in translation, I think, to get our undergrads at least started. People who don't have the language abilities quite yet, maybe. But again, this is another area where we have to, I think, get to work too, because I really want us not to just do, well, this is East Asian environmental literature, but to join in the conversations with scholars of American and British and now post-colonial environmental literature, because American Association for Literature and Environment is huge, and their listserv is very active. So it's a wonderful community of scholars. I just would like to see a little more, making it a more globalized organization. So translation certainly played a huge role in that. As people start reading Jiang Wong and get really excited by him and want to read more. So.
Okay, on that note, I think we can thank.
Okay.